Your Excellency, welcome to the Trending Echoes podcast.
Great to be here.
For our listeners, my name is Nicholas Lyle. I'm a senior researcher at Trends Research and Advisory, and today we are very lucky to be joined by His Excellency Nickolay Mladenov, who currently is the Director General of the Anwar Gargash Diplomatic Academy here in Abu Dhabi, which is essentially the institution tasked with training and equipping the next generation of the diplomatic corps in the Emirates. Your Excellency, long before this role that you joined at Anwar Gargash in 2022, if I'm not wrong, you had a nearly two-decade career across politics, across diplomacy, and I think it bears repeating for our audience in the context of today's episode. It started in Bulgaria in the early 2000s as a member of Parliament for a few years, and then His Excellency moved on to the European Parliament for the EU for several years. And then you went back to Bulgaria and became the Defence Minister in the late 2000s, and then moved on to become the Foreign Minister of Bulgaria. And then you moved into international, transnational, multilateral diplomacy, and you became the UN Special Representative for Iraq in 2013 until 2015, which was obviously a particularly salient period because it coincided with the rise of Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. And then after Iraq, it was a bit of a case of out of the frying pan into the fire, if I'm not wrong, and you became the UN Special Coordinator for the Middle East peace process, a role that you held from 2015 until 2020. And obviously this role saw extensive mediation between the Israeli and the Palestinian leadership. And then after that, you made the trip to the Emirates and became Director General. So quite a background, and we're very lucky to have someone with that top-level diplomatic experience across Europe, the Middle East, and international diplomacy in general here today. And given that particular background, but also given we are here today at the Global Media Conference here in Abu Dhabi, I'd like to dig into this experience of yours through the lens of the relationship between media and modern diplomacy. And I guess a good place to start would be navigating the information space in the modern age vis-a-vis Middle East diplomacy. And let's start with your role in Iraq from 2013 to 2015. As I mentioned, it coincided with the rise of Islamic State, and Islamic State was unprecedented in many ways, but one of the ways was the methods in which they used media or exploited media for recruitment purposes. And I can think back to the way they overlaid their recruitment videos with sort of Call of Duty-esque video game music to sort of prey on the sensibilities of the young video gaming generation. I can think back to the very well-produced documentary feature-type videos, as well as the very glossy and polished pamphlet material and printed material. Given that, did much of what you had to do in that role in Iraq essentially become a counter-propaganda mission? And further to that, were you and your team and the broader diplomatic ecosystem in which you were embedded, were you prepared for that use and exploitation of media in the role that you held there?
Well, thank you for that question. But first of all, let me say that I'm very happy to be here at the World Media Congress and in your podcast with Trends. You take me back to a time which is very much in the, I would say, at least in my mind, the early days of the social media revolution in politics. This was a time at which it was not just Islamic State that was becoming very savvy at using social media and propaganda. It was the same time at which Al-Shabaab and Somalia was becoming much more active. And on Twitter, they used a lot of Twitter in that case to reach out to people and to radicalize them. What I think, the short answer to your question is like, no, the UN, the international system was not prepared for that. And we had to struggle with a very new form of aggression that was coming out through both mainstream and social media. Because what we did see, however, in advance of the fall of Mosul was a concerted effort for a few months by ISIS to take down all legitimate structures in the Mosul Governorate of Iraq, and to do it in a very public way. This was car bombs, kidnappings, women suicide bombers in schools, a lot of that happening, and it was done in a systematic way, in a way which was also filmed and put on TV. In fact, sometime during that period, I asked my team to put together a list of videos that normal Iraqis would see coming out of the propaganda from Islamic State. And I spent a few hours, probably some of the more disturbing hours of my time there, watching these videos, because I wanted to make sure that as the lead UN person dealing with this crisis, I was able to, at least for a little bit of it, picture what normal Iraqis have to deal with in terms of the propaganda they're seeing. It was all very orchestrated, very well done. Again, by comparison of today's standards, it was pretty elementary back then. Things have evolved quite rapidly. On behalf of the international community, the effort was also emerging at that point to understand that there is a narrative that you need to counter, not just in terms of boots on the ground and taking control and holding territory from these radicals, but you need to counter the narrative. And one of the most innovative efforts was actually here in the UAE. It was a joint UAE-US effort. It was called the Sawab Center, which actually now, in a very much transformed way, is hosted at the Anwar Gargash Diplomatic Academy. But Sawab was created during the anti-ISIS coalition to counter the narrative online of Daesh. And they've built quite a lot of experience in not just tracking the little quote-unquote wars that were happening online at that point, but actually being able to counter them with effective strategies and narratives. What emerged, I think, from that, at least in my understanding, was that you need a concerted day-to-day, day-after-day effort to be able to bring down these radical images and very, very well done propaganda narratives that were coming out. A few years later, when I was in Jerusalem, I came back to Sawab to check if actually what was happening then in Gaza. This was probably 2018 when the US moved its embassy to Jerusalem, and there were hundreds of thousands of people protesting in Gaza. A lot of people were killed. It was a very difficult escalation. And I wanted to check with Sawab if actually Daesh had tapped into that as a recruiting potential, and yes, they had. So to my mind, two lessons were learned during that period. One is that you have to constantly, relentlessly have a team that looks at what is happening in the online space to be able to challenge these radical narratives coming out of Islamists. And secondly, you need to be aware that they are very quick at picking up topics and themes that they can use for their recruitment. So during 2018, during the crisis in Gaza, Daesh, leftovers in Iraq and Syria, were quick to, sort of take in the pictures of the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, take pictures of what's happening in Gaza and say, look, join us because this is what we're standing against. And countering that is a very complicated process. Lastly, I think, the good side is always fighting an uphill battle on this, because we are much more constrained in what we can do, both as governments, as international organizations, and we need to sort of really bring in a whole new generation of people to be able to address these new challenges. Now, again, that was 2014, 2018. Things have dramatically changed, I think, when we look at it from today's perspective. Also with my own experience later with how I used social media in a lot of the negotiations that we had to undertake.
So there's a lot to pick up on there, and I think the first thing I'll grab onto is you referenced the protests in Gaza, and so that was the Great March of Return, for which essentially was for many months over 2018 to 19 was hundreds and hundreds of Gazans protesting at the border fence, protesting against the blockade. And as you mentioned, that saw a lot of violence inflicted on them from the IDF, deaths across journalists, civilians, and so on. And that gave, as you mentioned, very fertile images and media for actors like Daesh to exploit. But obviously it also gave rise or engendered a space in terms of the Israeli-Palestinian process of competing narratives. So in that sense, and given that that time your role was for the Middle East peace process, so Israeli-Palestinian focused, but nonetheless, as you mentioned, not even the second order effects, but the sort of the systems level effect of this in terms of the ability for actors like Daesh more regionally to exploit what is happening in Gaza. Do you believe, therefore, that there needs to be a more systemic level approach to this matter? So you're dealing with competing media narratives just within Palestine and Israel, but also you have to tie that into what you're considering more broadly on a regional level. Do you think the diplomatic infrastructure, the diplomatic ecosystem that currently exists, or maybe that existed at that time, is geared to operate at that systemic level, or do you find that there's potentially too much atomization within that system and therefore it's unable to appreciate the systems level manifestation of these issues?
Let me start with an interesting, I think, example. When I arrived in Jerusalem to take up the UN role, I called in the head of our media team. And I asked him, I said, does our office have a Twitter account? Are we on Twitter? And he says, yes, we do, but we don't use it. And I said, why? He said, well, we'd like to keep our work away from social media, because on social media, whenever we put something out, we get immediately attacked by one or two or both of the sides. And, we don't want to have that, and we'd like to stay a little bit away from the limelight. And I found personally that attitude very unhelpful. And we quickly changed it. Because I very much believe that if you're in the business of diplomacy, in the business of mediation, you have to be extremely careful how you craft your narrative, but you have to be able to craft your narrative and you have to be able to put it out there. Because if you don't put it out there, you lose a little bit of the space in which you can actually do your work. So during this period, so this is probably 2016, 17, 18, you talked about the protests at the Gaza fence. During that period, the situation was very tense, and we were very focused on mediating an arrangement that would allow for that violence to be reduced. I always hesitated to call it a ceasefire because that has other implications. But in that period, I think we very quickly realized that our ability to have a consistent narrative of what we're doing and to be able to put it out again on social media, in mainstream media, in our reports to the Security Council, in an understandable way was probably one of the factors which allowed us to have, us meaning the UN, to have the space to have an effective mediation. Otherwise, we would have been crushed by the narratives of both sides, which are quite aggressive and quite, firmly set. To me, that experience was critical in understanding how important it is to use these tools that are emerging to the advantage of diplomacy. Now, of course, there's a dangerous side to it, is that you can either sort of flip into being too formal, and we see a lot of people doing that, very formal, very clean statements, institutional, that they don't have the personality, nothing from the personality comes through, and that they get quickly discarded and they're not picked up. Or you can become very much entangled into the weeds. of who said what and how they said it, and then it becomes counterproductive. So it's a very dangerous, it's a very thin line you need to thread, and it takes, I think, a lot of skill. In our case, it was a lot of learning from experience. I think since then, not just myself, my team back then, but everyone has learned a little bit more how to do these things better. The UN has taken a specific effort to look at cyber mediation and tools that are useful and how you interact with social media during mediation processes. I've been parts of some of the groups that will discuss that. It is something that here in the Anwar Gargash Diplomatic Academy in Abu Dhabi we're spending quite a lot of time on, trying to understand what comes next and how diplomats should interact. Because, again, to me always the risk is, one, you either become too formal and then you lose impact. You become too granular in what you do and you become part of the noise. And the real challenge is to be able to really craft a narrative that you're able to defend. And just another anecdote, during this period when we were doing these negotiations, a few people in my team kept coming to me and saying, like, look, we're getting tired of you saying the same thing all the time. You always say, like, we need 1, 2, 3, we need 1, 2, 3. And, people are asking you about other things and you're not responding to any of their questions. You're going always to these 3 things. And I said, listen, our point is to get our narrative out. And the point at which we begin to realize that our narrative is out is when we start seeing other people, be that on social media or on mainstream media or in the UN Security Council, say back to us the things that we're saying. That means that we're in control of this process. And from a mediator's perspective, I think that is for the future, that is a critical skill to master and a critical balance to be able to uphold. Otherwise, I fear you just get drowned in the noise.
Indeed. And it's interesting there, what I took from a lot of that is implicitly the distinction between traditional interpersonal skills on a face-to-face human level and also the ability to be interpersonal in a sense through media, online or otherwise. And you also mentioned, or at least referred to, the UN in a sense being maybe dragged into the exigencies of the modern media age in a diplomatic sense. Tying that all together, and again also referencing, you were talking about training young diplomats now to be able to navigate all those realities. In your experience, have you found that what makes a traditional, let's say, pre-modern media diplomat a good, effective pre-modern media diplomat is different or maybe unaligned with what the exigencies are for a modern diplomat to be able to, of course, the face-to-face interpersonal side is still crucial, but being able to play the other side as well, the online space and the media space do you find there's a tension there between what traditional diplomats were and represented as characters and personalities with skill sets and what the modern diplomat must embody?
Absolutely. And I think one of the most exciting and challenging things that we do here in the Academy is that we're the cutting edge of that change. Because in the old days, I think it was more accepted or traditional of diplomats to be people who do things quietly, behind closed doors, with a lot of reflection, a lot of instruction from their capital, but generally away from the media and away from the public scrutiny. That is changing everywhere in the world. I think today, going into the world of the future, to be a diplomat and to be effective, you need to understand that, first of all, you're no longer just dealing with states. You're no longer just dealing with foreign ministries. You're dealing with a lot of non-state actors who are becoming much more influential. So let's say this has been going on for some time, so people are already attuned to this. But you're also dealing in a different environment in which you are required to have much more specialized knowledge, which before probably you didn't need to have. Just to give you a couple of examples, COP28, which was in Dubai last year, this year just finished in Baku, involves a lot of diplomats. A lot of these diplomats who are negotiating the intricacies of the agreements related to climate change need to have specialized knowledge that is, not traditional for somebody in the foreign service. They need to understand the science of climate change. They need to understand the intricacies of all these financial agreements that are being drafted, their impact on industry, etc., etc. So you need that specialized knowledge. Similarly, if you're dealing with economic diplomacy, for example, or you're dealing with regulation of artificial intelligence, there are many, many new fields that you, as a diplomat, you need to sort of bring into your knowledge sphere to be able to function. And thirdly, I think it's the changed media environment. Everything happens now around the world, for good or for bad, pretty much in the public domain. That space of private conversations is closed to a great extent. Just look at the last few months. The news cycle has been dominated by news coming out of the US or Israel or Qatar or France or I don't know where. This person flew to that country to negotiate a Gaza deal. They landed, they took off. This is what's in the deal. This is what isn't in the deal. We went, the whole world pretty much lived with the ups and downs of the Gaza ceasefire negotiations, which unfortunately have not materialized for a few months. And that level of public scrutiny for diplomats is not traditional. And they need to get used to this, and they need to, once you not just get used to it, but they need to be able to play the game as well, knowing what information to put out that is beneficial and what information to withhold. And perhaps finally, I think the big change, if you wish, is that you're dealing also with such a different communications environment that a lot of the work that traditional diplomats have done has already been taken by others. Ministers can easily WhatsApp each other and square, the circle on a deal without having to go through the embassies and so on and so on. Often, ambassadors need to run after and catch up with what's happening, at the level of the leadership of their ministers around the world because of these instant communications that exist. But they can also use these instant communications to really resolve issues quicker than in the past. And this has, again, a benefit and a downside. It's beneficial because you get business done more quickly, but there's a downside that, people sort of tend to lose focus on the details, and they don't scrutinize details as much as they've done in the past, and this is not always a good thing.
So given you mentioned opportunities there, but also challenges, essentially a more complex operating space, greater pressures on the individual to have a broader array of skill sets and abilities, and that complexity is increasing. It's not stable, it's getting harder and harder. Given that, given there is a limit on an individual human ability, thinking more at the broader level of, let's say, countries and international organisations within diplomacy, how can they collaborate more effectively to address these exigencies of the modern media age? We can talk about particularly in conflict zones and conflict resolution context, or diplomacy more general. And where does the role of diplomacy sit in that? So taking it away from the individual diplomat more to the ecosystem space, and what the role or the requirements or the exigencies are for entities at that level to play their part in responding to this increasing complexity you were alluding to.
Well, I think first of all, governments or foreign ministries in general need to, at the institutional level, realize that the nature of their business has changed. And that implies putting in place not just guidelines for how to use and interact with social media, but also training people on its how to use them and how to benefit. Now, the good side of that is that the young people that are coming into the profession now, most of them come in with already a fairly good knowledge of this, and they need to be sort of prepared for the inevitable limitations that government puts in these in this field and how they can use it professionally. But they know how to do it. We've had fascinating experiences in the academy where we've brought people to train young diplomats on social media interaction, and after the first class, one of the professors came out and said, well, I don't know what I'm doing here. They already know what to do. So that level needs to be there. I think, secondly, it's very important now in the current stage in which we are to get institutions to be able to also put in place tools that help diplomats and professionals distinguish fake from true. Because this, if it was a problem a little bit perhaps in 2014-15, has become probably the biggest challenge of today. Distinguishing what is fake from what isn't. And in that sense, I think, again, institutions need to be able to prepare their people, but to also put in place training and guidelines and tools in that sense. And certainly a lot of tools already exist out there. More need to be developed. It's a much broader problem than just within government. It's a problem for whole societies, and how do we address this in general. But from a professional perspective, it's a particularly important challenge, I think, because in this hurried pace in which we all live, just going onto your social media news tracker and seeing, the inevitable breaking news coming out of somebody that looks pretty scandalous or outrageous, and you can get carried away that that's really happened. You need to double check, did it really happen? What's the source? How credible it is, etc. That filter, which maybe in the past you had, this filter of credibility, which you had through sort of more traditional media, is very much gone. And it's up to us as individuals to do it. So systems need to be put in place. I would say also, thirdly, at more of an institutional level, international organizations in particular need to be much better prepared than they are today. There's a lot of inertia in international institutions in how to deal with social media. Many still believe that this is just another version of a press release, just shorter, and that is certainly not the case. There are some good examples that exist, I think, within the UN system. For example, UNESCO has been UNICEF has been quite good at adjusting to that. Other parts of the system not so good, but there need to be more guidelines and put in place, and more practice. And ultimately, yes, this is all at an institutional level, but ultimately it goes back down to the individual, and in particularly in complex mediations. Where you expect the UN or the African Union or one of the other multilateral organizations to deploy an envoy to resolve a conflict. Whatever guidelines you have, whatever processes you have in place, that person needs to be able to deal with these issues. And I would say that, particularly in conflict areas, because whether it's Libya, whether it's the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, whether it's the crisis in Lebanon now, or whether it's any other Sudan or any other conflict that you have anywhere else in the world, these conflicts attract a lot of social media interest, and if you're a mediator in such a situation, you need to be very much equipped with the tools you need to deal with it, and you need to be prepared for the onslaught that usually follows your job.
So a common theme I'm getting from all of that is the necessity for critical thinking
Yeah.
capacity amongst diplomats. And you mentioned at the beginning there of the increasing dexterity that youth, even millennials, Gen Z, those generations now have, that you see coming through as the new diplomatic corps in social media, in online communication. It's often also said, though, that the increasing extent to which those generations rely on things like generative AI and even social media in a way dulls the capacity for critical thinking across individuals. Are you, therefore, in terms of your role at Amro Gogash Diplomatic Academy, do you see and do you sense, and are you responding to a need to improve critical thinking capacity amongst the next generation of diplomats coming through? How are you, if so, how are you pursuing that, and how is it going so far?
Well, I actually always believed that the future is inevitable. And, these changes are happening around us, whether it's generative AI or other inventions that, will be coming along. They will be there. We can't shy away from them. Once they've been invented and they've been put out on the market, we have to deal with them. Of course, we have to find ways to improve them and tailor them to our needs, but we can't pretend that they're not there. So what we try and teach increasingly our graduates is how to use these tools in a responsible way, but also how not to lose track of the fact that they're there only to help and that they will not replace the personal negotiation. You can very easily ask ChatGPT to draft a Gaza ceasefire agreement, and it would probably do a fairly good job of it in principle. But if you just take that text and you try and show it to the different sides, and you ask them to agree to it and say, well, you know what, this was drafted by ChatGPT, it's the most powerful, language model in the world, etc., etc. They're still not likely to agree to it because the nuance that you need, or because of the human interaction, still needs to be there. So yes, these tools are there to help, but we need to have people prepared to utilize them, and as you rightly said, to have that level of critical thinking as well. For us in the academy, it's very important to, from day one, we tell our students and future Emirati diplomats that, if in the past their job as diplomats would have been to represent their country, to hold the flag in another country and represent them there, today their job is no longer just about representing their country. Today their job is actually looking for opportunities for their country, whether that's bringing investments into the UAE or UAE investments into other countries, upholding what the UAE stands for as in terms of its national agenda, and sometimes even fighting for it. Not physically fighting for it, but intellectually defending it and advancing it. And this requires that level of critical thinking that is extremely, extremely important. So we have, I remember we started a course called Future Foreign Policy Leaders a couple of years ago. And after each session, we had a small session to deconstruct the lecture. So we would bring someone in for a class, and then after they finish the class and they leave, we would sort of look to our students and say, okay, now let's be absolutely critical of what you heard and see how we can break it down, because that skill is a skill that can be very easily lost in the technology age, and it needs to be kept. And that's why it's very important. The other thing that we always keep telling them, it's very important to listen to people that you disagree with, to be able to have the intellectual strength and capacity to hear somebody that you disagree with, to read texts that you disagree with, and to be able to challenge them. particularly in conflict areas. I mean, the Middle East, unfortunately, now is full of very serious and dangerous conflicts. And each of the sides in these conflicts has its own narrative. Now, if you choose only one side in each one of these conflicts, you will fail to understand what is at the essence of what is going on. So you need to be able to listen to everyone. And again, here in the UAE, I think that's perhaps a little bit easier because this is still very much a country that that is able to talk to everyone, have relations with countries and people that usually disagree with each other. And that's a strength that we try to build into our diplomats as well for the future.
Wonderful. Now, Your Excellency, I'm aware you need to head off to the airport, so I'll just wrap up by asking, a lot of what we talked about today comes down to stories.
Yeah.
Who tells the most powerful stories? What stories can achieve in motivating certain communities to pursue certain courses of action? Looking back on your experience and your history across national politics, international diplomacy, transnational, multilateral diplomacy and organisations, how has that experience informed your views on the importance of storytelling in diplomacy and modern diplomacy in today's environment?
I have become a very, very firm believer in the fact that if you don't have a compelling story and you can't tell it in a compelling way, don't go into this business. And this is just as important in national politics, international relations, or diplomacy, or you name it. I think it's, in my mind at least, and I haven't done any research on it, but this is how I think of it. This is, in a way, a side effect of the information age that we live in, because there's so much noise. There is so much out there that there's now a greater importance, perhaps, than in the past, of how you are able to tell your story. And whether it's the story of your country as a diplomat, representing it abroad, whether it's the story of the narrative of why you're trying to arrange a ceasefire, sign a peace deal, prevent a conflict, whatever it is, or whether it is, in domestic politics, it's a critically important skill, and it is a skill that is worth nurturing and developing, and it requires knowledge of history, it requires knowledge of society, it requires knowledge of current affairs. It's not just current affairs. Many people think it's just, what's happening now. No, a lot of what you see happening now is because of things that happened in the past. And you need to understand them because of trends that are much larger historically than what we see. And this is, again, a skill that we try to, I hope, embed in our future diplomats here in the UAE, but it is a skill that is essential for anyone in the age of today and tomorrow.
Well, Your Excellency, thank you very, very much. There were interesting anecdotes. There was a small textbook's worth of insights and lessons, whether you're talking about navigating media information or becoming a diplomat in that modern context. I found it fascinating. I'm sure all of those listening and watching also found it fascinating. And who knows, hopefully Anurag Ogash Diplomatic Academy will have a few more bright individuals come in after being inspired by some of what you said today. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
And safe travels.
Thank you very much.